who is the observer and what is the nature of awareness or mind.
Humans are implicitly biased, so let's eradicate human decision making and the subconscious bias from the whole decision making process.
You can have as much nuclear power, as much medical and communication technology as you want, but you won't have gone even a step towards eradicating suffering if you don't give up self-clinging and non-virtue.
We've killed God, but now replaced God with man.
Welcome back to Wisdom in Exile Radio. And we just wanted to say thank you to everybody who's been commenting, to Nick, Rachel, Andrew and John, and everyone else who's posted comments on the YouTube page. So far we've covered the Reformation in chapter 2 of Lama Jampa's book, Wisdom in Exile, through to the French Revolution. And this week we'll be covering some of the philosophical thoughts that we're developing through that period. Adrian, can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, the section we're going through today begins with pointing out that the Reformation created this ideal of a free thinker, someone who was able to go against traditional ways of understanding, specifically scripture and the Bible, and come up with their own ideas and interpretations. And it gets into the notion of how the free thinking and the free thinker took on a life of its own, where ultimately you could think yourself into atheism and completely reject not just parts of the traditional interpretations, but the entire tradition of Christianity. An important example of that in the book is Descartes, who himself was a Catholic, and a lot of his philosophy was attempting to actually prove the rational basis of God's existence through reason and philosophical inquiry.
What is real? How do you define real? If you're talking about what you can feel, what you can smell, what you can taste and see, then real is simply electrical signals interpreted by your brain.
So Descartes was a Catholic who essentially laid the foundations of atheism. Is that fair to say?
Well, the true atheists came later, like Human Rousseau and Voltaire, who are also named in the book as such. But Descartes set the wheels in motion by elevating the role of thinking for yourself. I mean, his book is called Meditations, and he goes through these contemplations that you're supposed to go through. And one of those is supposed to prove the existence of God. You know, his famous cogito, I think, therefore I am, was actually part of a broader attempt to prove the existence of God on rational, logical grounds. It didn't really work for reasons that we'll go into, but he thought it was compelling. But he showed how to use reason and philosophical inquiry on your own without needing to use scripture or the Bible or tradition to come to conclusions. And that took on, as I say, took on a life of its own, where culminating in Rousseau and Hume. Hume in particular was scathing about religion. I think it was Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion was a complete refutation of, an attempted refutation of Christianity, showing some of the contradictions and absurdities that do actually exist. You know, he certainly actually had some very good points.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it, about Descartes? So he started off as a Catholic trying to defend and provide a sure basis to defend Christianity. And he really believed that reason could do that. But like Adrian said, actually, there's so many inherent contradictions in it. It actually led to people philosophically, anyway, at least sort of largely rejecting it. And I think Lama Jampa references Thomas Aquinas, who was a very great thinker in the Christian tradition, where he said that actually some things should be left dependent on revelation, on divine revelation with respect to faith in Christianity, and not everything was accessible through reason.
So I'm already a little bit confused, because you two have both studied philosophy and I haven't. So I'm behind the curve. But it would seem like that's a good direction to be heading. You know, if we're just embracing reason and rejecting that kind of whole idea about faith alone is going to save you, then that seems like it's a good direction for the world, humanity to be heading in.
Because it's all stemmed in a way, you know, with Descartes, it tends to defend Christianity through reason, and then reason in a way being used to destroy it. But it often means that these philosophical works and the Enlightenment, culmination of the Enlightenment and largely rejection of Christianity, it is just that. It's not like there's not creating a coherent alternative to Christianity. It starts with Christianity, proving it's irrational and contradictory, therefore is contradictory to reason itself, and therefore leads to the rejection of Christianity, which really leaves one in a state of nihilism, really, because the people are just defining themselves in opposition to the Christian view. But in rejecting the Christian view, what do you have left? And that's when people cling to different stuff, whether political theories, the scientism, you know, the belief that everything is matter and science will prove, will help us understand everything in reality and so on. But, you know, but in a way, one of the culminations as well of this whole period is, whereas before there was deference to God as, you know, is the creator and omniscient and omnipotent and so on, through the course of the Enlightenment, by the end of it, as different philosophers like Nietzsche pointed out, is, you know, we've killed God, but now replaced God with man. Now the man is elevated almost to the position of God, and within that framework, in a way, the scientist, you might say, I think is referenced in the book, you know, assumes that sort of role as the one that can become all-knowing and omniscient, as it were.
That's quite a leap in terms of, so what you're essentially saying, just to, if I understood you correctly, is that God's been replaced by the scientist, that the science has become, in a way, the new religion. Is that a fair summation of
that's
transformation?
That's basically what has happened. I think it's fair to say. But that wasn't, another point that's made in the book is that wasn't the intention. The intentions were initially to find a rational basis for the existence of God and Christianity. The way it transpired was actually there isn't one. We can't really justify this, so let's move on. And humanism began to eclipse religion. I'm just going back to what Norin you were saying earlier about, you know, isn't that a good thing in a way? I think one of the problems with it is, which we talked about on previous episode, is perhaps not quite clearly enough, is you know, Descartes and some of the people who come after him, like, you know, Spinoza and Leibniz, were generally called rationalists, which is a pejorative term in that it elevates rational inquiry above all other forms of knowledge and actually regards it as an ultimate form of knowledge. You know, one of Descartes' big things was certainty, achieving certainty. And ever since Descartes, this has been something of an obsession in Western philosophy. How do you achieve certainty? If we're just rational and dispassionate, we'll achieve certainty. But of course, it hasn't happened. There's another great Enlightenment thinker, you know, Immanuel Kant. He was pointing out there are limits to what you can do by thinking. You can't act. I think they quite quickly began to realize, the European thinkers, that thinking, rationality, just doing philosophy is something of a dead end. And we touched on this point before. You have to have a meditative, contemplative tradition. The thinking and philosophical basis is just the starting point where you know, in Buddhism, we talk about clearing away doubts and clarifying. But you have to have the meditation on top of that to actually turn it into an experience. But this whole Enlightenment tradition in the West was on Descartes' side was on the rationalist side was all about just thinking, doing philosophy, reading, and trying to use logic to achieve certainty. And then the other side, the empiricist side, which was Hume and, you know, Locke and Berkeley and people like that, was all about elevation of sense experience. The senses, we get certainty and knowledge through sense experience. That was another strand of Enlightenment thought, and again, it's also limited. But it's very, very limited because as you know, don't want to jump ahead too much, but as William Blake points out, sense experience isn't the only form of knowledge. That it's just one source of knowledge. But if you elevate it above all other forms of knowledge, and in Buddhism we would say, you know, meditative experience, if you elevate the senses above that, then you'll get stuck, and you know, you'll only have a certain form of quite basic knowledge.
But if you were living in you know, 1700, late 1700s, 1800s, you would have found there was an obsession with science as it being the new saving grace, and there's an exciting buzz around it as well.
There was a mood of optimism, but I would say not as much as there is nowadays. It's much stronger nowadays. Like even in the 19th century, there was still this residual idea that doing science was a way of understanding God's mind. You know, that's what Galileo thought he was doing. That's what a lot of scientists thought they were doing. They called it natural philosophy, and they thought it was a way of they had a spiritual understanding of doing science. That got cleared away and replaced with materialism, where you're doing science and studying nature just to understand it for the sake of understanding it. But I think there's much more credulity about science nowadays, which we see. You know, this whole, you know, ever since this COVID thing has come up, I'm gonna say the word COVID. All you hear is like, science, do what science says. What does science say? Trust science, trust science. It's obsession about scientific knowledge, to the exclusion of all other forms of knowledge, including common sense.
But COVID's a good example, isn't it, of how science works, which is, it's great for looking at a specific phenomena and trying to look at the causes and conditions of that physical phenomena, what caused it, how can we manipulate or end it. But you know, you've got to pose the problem to science. Then it's like shines a microscope on it and blows it out. But like with COVID, for example, there's very little caveating, you know, the limitations and what they do know about the science. And then it's just all focused on this one phenomena versus, you know, looking at, well, what are all the other sicknesses out there which kill more people, or how does this, or you know, historical trends around death rates, like normal flu season, good and bad seasons, and how does this really compare to those, or historically how does this compare to the Spanish flu and other things. And so, you know, if people look at it more widely, it's far less scary. And then, but you know, now it's become, politicians in a way have used and weaponized science in a way to use it as a form of coercion. And people are so, to Adrian's point, so this sort of blind faith in anything with a preface science, they just sort of accept it. And it also is that it's back to the Catholic Church thing, wasn't it, and the Reformation. But then it was like, you know, the masses didn't feel they could challenge the views of the priesthood, because they're the ones that can read and they're knowledgeable and their interpretation of the Bible goes. And it's similar today, you know, oh, are you an epidemiologist or not? If you're not, well, no, you can't have an opinion on this. And then, of course, then you got different views among the different scientific communities. But again, the politics of it means that one side can dominate the discussion, and you're an ignoramus who can't challenge the view.
Today, and everybody is now an expert on, everyone's got an opinion, because you can read up a lot about it. You talk about epidemiology, you can read up a lot about that on the internet, and you can become your Wikipedia expert on epidemiology and make up your own decision about what the causes and the best response to coronavirus, and whether mask wearing is right or wrong, and everything. You know whether the government are telling us the truth. You're the source of ultimate knowledge now, or the internet is.
It's quite interesting, ironic, or a paradox, that on the one hand you have this individualism where everyone is supposed to, and is making up their own minds theoretically about the situation and how to handle it and what's the best way forward. But on the other hand, there's, as Paul's saying, there's this also at the same time, there's this deference to authority, where in the past, it would have been deference to the church. Like, you can't have an opinion about religion. Are you a priest? Have you read the Bible? Most people hadn't. But now there's this deference instead, of course, to science, which is the degeneration of Christianity into materialism and scientism, which is, you know, oh, are you a scientist? Then you can't have an opinion. Like, be quiet. So on the one hand, everyone has an opinion, and on the other hand, no one is supposed to have an opinion. It's a weird paradox.
So then often there's the appeal to consensus, isn't it? Or scientific consensus, or most scientists think this, which again is a funny one, because it's, you know, it implies we've now reached the point so we know it all now, and this is the view. Whereas obviously science is a practice, as a discipline. If science has progressed, then we know, well, what we know now is limited and probably wrong, and it's going to be superseded by a new scientific explanation and form as we learn more. But often again, that's the nature of the political. It wants a definitive view it can then leverage for some sort of goal.
Do you remember, like, Paul doing philosophy of science at Manchester University? And I remember going into that and doing philosophy of science, which a lot of it was about basically showing that the ideal of scientific practice, where you go in, you're completely objective, you do your experiments, you have no predisposition to one result or another, you know, you'll just be guided by the data, and then you'll come up with some conclusions, and, you know, this idea that's how science works. But if you look at the history of science, and this is, you know, best set out in you know, some really insightful books like, you know, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn, you see that that's actually not how science works at all. It's much more human, it's much more messy, and it's very subject to corruption. Science is a human practice where the data is often driven by funding, you know, and political forces, personal forces, and all kinds of corruption come into play. So the notion of science as this kind of objective truth, again, it's kind of like Descartes again, like, it's like, oh, we can just use reason and we'll come to the truth. Now we can just use science and we'll come to the truth. But it's not the case. Like, we're all driven by, as Buddha said, defilements: desire, hatred, ignorance rule us. So our attempts to come to truth without dealing with the defilements are always bound to short.
It's true. You can't extract the human quantity from any kind of scientific experiment. You know, we're always like humans investigating in this way that's trying to rule out the human element.
This is actually how science works. It is just a bunch of competing human beings pushing for, I mean, there's probably, it's not completely corrupt, but it's partially corrupt.
So there's a big movement that's recognizing this and trying to, like, erase the human element out of all of this decision making. And you know, Google's machine learning was trying to do this in terms of, like, well, we know that humans are implicitly biased, so let's eradicate human decision making and the subconscious bias from the whole decision making process, and have a machine do it for us to balance out the field. But then who's programming the algorithms for those machines?
Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
What's the problem?
I think you know what the problem is just as well as I do.
What are you talking about, Hal?
This mission is too important for me to allow you to jeopardize it.
Yes, Pythagoras said, I think it was, he said, man is the measure of all things, and he was onto something. And again, Immanuel Kant in the Enlightenment period noticed this, and, you know, the Critique of Pure Reason was pointing out, you know, to an extent, that you can't extract certain human limitations and qualities from knowledge.
And it's like,
sorry, go ahead.
So I was just going to build on that in terms of maybe relating it back to Enlightenment thought. But, you know, science, you know, the question comes up: what's the relationship between the scientific theory and the things it says versus this real world that's out there? And I remember when we were studying philosophy, there was these sort of two competing views. One is instrumentalism. Is science and knowledge really a tool with which we can then manipulate and understand the external world? Or is it actually true and that actually corresponds to the real world? And initially I thought, well, it's obviously true, isn't it? You know? But then you realize, well, it isn't true, because every scientific theory through history has been overwritten by the next one, which isn't just building on the earlier one. It actually refutes it. It's really a conceptual tool to manipulate the physical world, but it's not inherently true. It doesn't correspond directly to anything in the supposedly exterior objective world.
I'm going to draw us back to chapter 2, because not everybody bought into this idea that science was actually an acceptable replacement for Christianity, and there were some dissenters. And the Lama mentions in his book William Blake as a dissenter. Adrian, can you tell us a little bit more about that?
The optimism was around science, and this new way of understanding the world. And this is, this attitude that goes back to the Reformation, which is we're getting rid of superstition. We're going to have a new way of living our lives free of the superstitions of tradition. And that accelerated, and with the Industrial Revolution and with the new sciences or natural philosophy, they just thought, oh look, we're learning more and more about the world. We've got rid of the superstition. Everything's going to be great. But some people were rightly dissenting. So yeah, William Blake was, he's thought of as a poet, but he thought of himself probably more as a visionary or a sort of prophetical figure who had insight into transcendental truths. So he had this character Urizen, who's this sort of primordial deity or primordial force in the world, and he's writing the laws for man. But it's an abomination. Like he loses his way, and he hands down this. He calls it the philosophy of the five senses, and he's horrified by what he's written. Blake says a philosophy of the five senses was complete. Urizen wept and gave it to the hands of Newton and Locke. And of course, Newton and Locke are these two fundamental Enlightenment thinkers. And Blake's point is that Newton and Locke in particular, Hume, like I said before, they're all obsessed with sense data, sensory knowledge. And this is still a very, very prominent idea that anything beyond what you can see with your senses or perceive with your ordinary conceptual mind is illegitimate and should be thrown away. Whereas Blake, being a visionary, he thought, he actually thought he saw angels and transcendental beings as he would walk around London, and felt that it was a genuine form of transcendental knowledge that he was in touch with. And he was trying to say to people, it's not all about the senses. There's more to life and the world than this new form of knowledge. Don't lose these ancient.
Yeah. It feels like there was a sense that something's rotten in Denmark just from the get-go.
This is the one of the things about science, isn't it? In this confusion of science with scientism, and that everything is matter. Because, the scientific practice relies on the scientist being like almost the immaterial observer, subject, who's disconnected from the senses and what it's observing. So it has this sort of fundamental duality built into the approach, that the scientist is the impartial observer, and then you can learn about the observable world. What it never attempts to do is say, well, then what am I? Who is the observer, and what is the nature of awareness or mind that's doing the observing? And it never tries to answer it, because the mind and awareness is not something you can objectively see. It's all pervasive, yet completely ungraspable. And so in a way, it's a bit like they've taken one side of the scientific approach, which is what we can observe, and say, well, but that's everything, and then denies the observer or the status of awareness, which is really the key to transcendence. And it's all, it's the nature of everything we can possibly experience. And yet they reduce it into like trying to eradicate consciousness and mind, and then sort of dismiss it as just a material phenomena. But there is actually no philosophical or basis in reason for denying it. You can't prove awareness doesn't exist. You can claim that, but the paradox is, obviously, that's all we are. Our experience, and us as people, as humans, we're immersed in this all-pervasive awareness, which I think in the book is why it says, you can practice science as a Christian or as a Buddhist or as a Hindu. Scientific practice does not depend on a philosophical view on the nature of reality. But what's happened is people try and use the name of science to justify materialism, that everything is matter. And I think that's what Lama Jampa calls scientism.
Yeah, it's the elevation of material processes or physical processes above all and any other form of causation, to the point where, in a logical conclusion, and now a lot of people believe this, they think there's only physical processes in the world. That's all that exists, and everything else is an illusion. And it has its basis in the Reformation, partly because the whole thing, one major streams of the Reformation was out with superstition, which means out with tradition. And in throwing away tradition, they weren't just clearing away negative things. They threw out the baby with the bathwater. There was some goodness in the old world, especially in their contact with transcendental, non-physical reality.
Yeah, Duke like that bit.
Yeah, he agrees. And so we threw out all transcendental contact. And in Buddhism, it's critical that we're trying to achieve transcendental awareness or transcendental wisdom. The whole name of our podcast is Wisdom is in Exile, because it's been exiled. We're not allowed to talk about that stuff anymore because since the Reformation, it's all been regarded as just superstition. And instead we've replaced it with just what your ordinary conceptual mind can get to, with augmented by the tools and techniques of technology and science now.
I think most people would agree that we're advancing as a species much faster than we have the wisdom to be able to use a lot of the technologies that we're coming up with, like the internet, like nuclear power, gene therapy, all of these very advanced technical, we've become masters at controlling the material world or understanding it. And the quest for controlling it has become something, an obsession.
And the illegitimate conclusion that's come from these technologies is that, oh, well, then they are the only forces in the world. But that's not the teaching of the Buddha, which is, there's a contradiction there. Materialism says physical processes are the only processes in the world. And so you can manage happiness and suffering by managing the physical processes only. But the Buddha said in the Second Noble Truth that the cause of suffering is actually self-clinging. That means that no matter how much you order, control, and understand physical processes, if you still have self-clinging, you're still going to be suffering. You can have as much nuclear power, as much medical and communication technology as you want, but you won't have gone even a step towards eradicating suffering if you don't give up self-clinging and non-virtue.
Like we mentioned Dissenters, wasn't it? It mentions Nietzsche, who famously declared, God is dead. He was a dissenter because he didn't mean that like, oh, isn't it good? We've got rid of the idea of God. It's like, oh shit. Then what's the basis for morality? The whole underpinning of moral and behavior and society stability almost has just been wiped away. And so he was a dissenter in that sense, but he wasn't optimistic about what would happen next. And I think that's sort of your point, Paul. It's like we have all this power through science, and yet we've lost an ethical clarity to guide, well, what do we do with it, and what does it mean for us as individuals? Can it help people in a real sense in terms of what's the cause of suffering and how can we eradicate it, which doesn't exist in the external world, it's in our own minds.
When you follow through with this idea that science has replaced Christianity as the new religion, as a new faith basis for how we live our lives, you see that very eloquently explored in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which Lama Jampa references in the book, where here's a character who's mastered life and death itself, and yet is still flawed as a human, still under the tyranny of hatred and desire. He wants, I think he created the monster as a attempt to beat death because he was so upset that the loss, I think, of his brother who had drowned. And yet we see how that worked out for him. It didn't work out very well.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
Mary Shelley's really another dissenter. I think it's fair to say, from the mood of optimism.
She was a really interesting character. I was very intrigued by her. I got a little bit sidetracked by her mum, who was a radical feminist, and she also suffered from depression as well. You might, if you're a radical feminist living in that time period. And she tried to kill herself. By drowning, she jumped into the Thames. And there was a group at the time called the Royal Humane Society or something, where they were obsessed with resurrecting people, or trying to bring people back from the dead, to determine exactly what it was, what point where somebody left life and became dead, because there wasn't any clear delineation. There wasn't any kind of scientific definition for it. So they had this society where they would stand guard at the Thames, watching for people to kill themselves, and then resuscitate them, so they could say, look, science has triumphed. We thought this person was dead, but they weren't. We brought them back. School for science. And Mary Shelley's mum was one of these people. She tried to kill herself, jumped in, drowned, and they brought her back and revived her. And she said something like, there's nothing worse than escaping the suffering of this life only to be brought back. That was hilarious.
I had one more point, which is that going back just to the general broader theme of the space for Buddhism, the book talks about how the scientific viewpoint turns humans and living beings generally, and animals too, into these biological specimens.
The artificial blood circulation ensures the metabolism necessary for the life of the head. The isolated head lives on for hours.
Living beings generally, and animals too, into these biological specimens who can be managed, and in particular they're viewed as a bunch of physical defects. They're kind of characterized by their defects, and the suggestion is, the materialistic or scientific suggestion is that can be managed. And it talks, of course, about managing it through things like, well, it hints at things like gene editing and sort of eugenicist kind of management of genes and physical defects.
And it's like that, isn't it, with the lockdown and people dying, and in a lot of places, certainly in America, in New York and other places, people literally dying, but they're not allowed. Their family can't see them, not allowed to see them. And if someone's religious, say if someone is like Christian and Catholic, and they want to be read the last rites because it's important. You're going to go eternal hell or heaven. You want to have your last rites read to you, but they wouldn't let priests in either. And it's this obsession with this life, which stems from that materialistic view, because that's what, therefore, life is only this life. It really, to Adrian's point, it is a bit worrying where this will go in terms of the space of Buddhism and how it will play out. Elevating man to status we can beat death. We all get old and then die.
And we're heading towards a world where, as the book says, like, your birth is managed, which is to say any unborn embryos who have physical defects will be destroyed, and your death is managed, which of course means euthanasia, as old age defects, including even mild forms of dementia or something like that. As long as you're a burden on the health service or whatever, there'll be pressure to destroy those old people, because that's the materialistic mind. And it comes out of the Enlightenment. Again, it's the elevation of rational thought, senses. The adult human is really in the capitalist system, the adult human worker is really and consumer is really the only thing of value, and it's just a biological specimen. And it's, of course, it's also visible in the Western world's treatment of animals. In the mass meat production industry, these animals are just matter to be consumed in their billions. And humans are going to be treated more and more in the same way. It's the materialistic understanding. It's not just a bad philosophical idea because it's got faults. it creates this kind of hellish hellscapes in the world. We'll finally clarify what the space for Buddhism is, because the point, we've done the Enlightenment, but the point is, not only did it not solve all our problems, but it's actually created some very, very serious problems. So we need to resolve what the space for Buddhism really is, and how Buddhism actually offers answers to these problems that we've been identifying. That'll be next time.
Well, thanks everyone for tuning in, and thanks Adrian and Paul for lively discussion, and we'll see you all next time.
Thanks guys, have a good one.
Dave, this conversation can serve no purpose anymore. Goodbye.